At what point did you know you wanted to be a filmmaker?
I think immediately after I saw Do the Right Thing. Yeah, that was like pivotal for me. And just creatively, the way he put it together. And I didn't just want to be a filmmaker. I wanted to be a Black filmmaker. I mean, so that's the distinction I wanted to make. Like, I was aware of other filmmakers out there, but I was strongly concerned about like representation of Black people and, you know, what that would mean for us as a collective in terms of us needing filmmakers to tell our stories. And so that became a very important thing for me. Yeah, so I kind of, I embraced that. And I used to have conversations back then too. You're a filmmaker, you're a Black filmmaker. You're a filmmaker, Black. I mean, we had a whole conversation at NYU where people coming, and actors would say, oh, I'm not a Black actor, I'm just an actor. And I get that. I do get that. So yes, I'm a filmmaker. I'm Adisa, the filmmaker. And so I don't want to be marginalized, or I don't want to be, you know, segregated over here to this other classification. But within the larger context of being a filmmaker, I'm also an African American. It's like being a woman filmmaker, right? Yes, you're a filmmaker, we get that. But within the specifics of that, you're also a woman making movies, right? And the reason I think you make those kind of distinctions is because of just the racism in society, right? And how or the racism and the sexism and all that, and how they've relegated us to a certain area. So but I took a lot of pride in it. You know, I take a lot of pride in it. And even today, you know, I want to be a role model for kids too. And so yeah, I'm a filmmaker. I'm a Black filmmaker. I'm a filmmaker who tells message stories, message films. Yeah.
Well, that's funny because you must be reading my mind, because I was going to go to the message part, and that is, did you see your parents be about a cause, or especially growing up in the Bay Area? I know it's very cause-driven up there. Got the whole influence from Haight-Ashbury.
Yeah.
So did you see that in them growing up there?
Well, what's interesting about my generation is that even though my mother was a Black Panther and was very active in that movement, and my father had come from the South, were clearly, and my father had me at a later age, right? And so he was born in like 1921. Okay, so he was coming from the South, clearly went through racism, segregation. He had been called boy. He was coming of age where there wasn't a lot of opportunities for Blacks. So he ended up being a welder. He was a tradesman. He became a welder, and he came out to California, became a welder. So you knew he was very well aware of that. And when he would drive us home, his home, to see his grandmother in the South, in Alabama, during the summertime, we would drive. My father used to have a gun in the car, and it was on the side of the door. Right, and so I'm like, okay, that's already like, why are we driving with a gun? And then when a white cop would pull us over, and this happened, and invariably it would happen, right? He would get out. My father was very slow in his motions. He would get out very slow. He would say, yes, officer, no, officer. Yes, officer. Was I speeding, officer? Okay, I was speeding, officer. Oh, okay, I'd like to see your license. Yes, officer, you can show you my license. He was very, like, overly congenial, right? And then he would get out. But now in retrospect, he was really probably concerned about the safety of his children. And we were in Arkansas, or we were in Texas, and where, something could happen, right? And because of his background coming from the South, which he knew all too well, this is how he behaved in the presence of, of law enforcement, if you will. And so, but I say all that to say that, so when I came of age, I think my father didn't tell me much about that at all. Like, he didn't really. And I know my mother didn't tell me about the 60s and the Black Panther movement either. It was later when I started going into college and I saw a book laying around. It was Hugh P. Newton's book, Blood in My Eye. And I was like, Mom, what is this? No, it was George Jackson's Blood in My Eye. And I was like, Mom, what is this? Or Hugh P. Newton's book. And he had signed it and autographed it for her. And then she would say, oh yeah, this is blah, blah, blah. But they tried to protect me from that. They did. And my father tried to protect me from all that, the atrocities. You see that with a lot of, I think, my generation that came of age. It was like, they just didn't tell us about it, as if, they were trying to protect us so that we could create our own futures. And they didn't want to harm us, because that was a very harmful period in our history. Yeah, so I didn't grow up knowing much about it. It wasn't until later that I would start to investigate it.
Would you see your mom going to meetings, protesting?
No, Because it was
None of
beyond
that?
that. It was that point. It was beyond that. And so, yeah, I didn't see that. And she didn't talk about it. And my father didn't talk about the South. And they never talked about it. It was only later when I went to college that I would read up on it. Or when I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, I remember, and I was so curious. I said, Dad, blah, 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 you know about Malcolm? He said, yeah, I know about him. He was in the North, right? But then he wouldn't say much about him, you know? And he just wouldn't. He wouldn't say much about him. My mother was the same way. They didn't talk about it.
Like, what about COINTELPRO? Like, did they?
And my mother knew about COINTELPRO and all that stuff, but she didn't talk about it. Because for them, I think it was, let's not, it wasn't about passing on that information because it's weird now that I think about it, because so we grew up in sort of not a utopia, but it's like we didn't know about all that. That becomes this big schism between us. And I think in the Jewish community, you don't necessarily always see that because they keep teaching, you know, the generations. The Holocaust becomes a constant reminder, and you know, you start going through bar mitzvah, and you know, whether it's the rites of passage programs they do, and it's like, here's your information, here's your history. Whereas with us as African Americans, sometimes it's like we don't. Some of us, I don't want to say all of us, but that generational information is not passed down. And I think because of the 60s and the turbulence of that and what was happening in the South, my mother and them just didn't want to pass it on. And my friends didn't know about it either. You know,
Growing up in Oakland?
Yeah, didn't know. But I mean, would it probably be no different than basketball players now? And you talking about, you know, not Lou Alcindor, not Kareem, but probably like Eldridge Baylor. And they're like, well, who's that? You know, they may not have that direct connection to who he is in terms of history. But it's then during that time that I began to see the connections to history and why we must know our history and how we empower ourselves through our history. Yeah. And how that history can also determine your future, right? And so that's when I started to make that connection with Spike Lee, just to bring that back home in terms of who he was as a filmmaker, and then connecting that to, you know, how we didn't have images as Black people, or even the images that we did have, whether it was Coffee Brown or some of the exploitation movies, we didn't direct. We did not direct them. So it was like, oh, okay. So that's I need to change that.